Hello again. Starting where we left off from last time, going into chapter 13, Jones begins the chapter by talking about Gotthard Lessing and Moses Mendelssohn, who were German Enlightenment figures, the latter being Jewish, the former being Gentile, with Lessing known for his play called Nathan the Wise, which famously kind of describes the three monotheisms, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as being three rings, and like all of these rings are kind of like saying the same thing, each having their own kind of truth, but really reflecting the overall truth of the world and whatnot. Essentially, Lessing is just trying to make the point that like religious tolerance is good, religious pluralism, like all religions are the same, yada yada yada. A kind of Enlightenment relativism. Whereas Mendelssohn was kind of like the precursor to the Jewish reform movement and believed in like embracing the German Enlightenment ideals and kind of escaping the shtetl view of Orthodox Judaism, kind of secluded away from their Gentile counterparts. Jones posits that instead of a conversion to Christianity, there's now this kind of conversion to Enlightenment reason and just essentially assimilation to secular culture that was starting to blossom at the time. And both traditional Christianity and traditional Judaism were kind of turning into, I guess you'd say, more liberal versions of themselves, with David Friedlander pioneering Reform Judaism after Mendelssohn, and kind of like liberal Protestant critiques of historical claims of Christianity were coming through as well. However, after the defeat of Napoleon, who kind of imposed this Enlightenment mode of thinking on Europe, there was a backlash against it, known as Romanticism, which wanted to harken back to pre-Enlightenment ideals and kind of like the mystique of the church and old medieval times. And of course, during these times, there was definitely more of a separation between Jews and Christians. I mean, they certainly weren't seen as like brothers in arms under a kind of a secular universalistic type thinking, but rather than going back to like a purely religious type of thinking, Jones says that Europeans rather moved towards kind of like a nationalistic and even racialistic at times understanding as a backlash against the Enlightenment, but also not exactly going back to like the pre-Enlightenment ideals totally of just basing their identity on Christianity. It was kind of like a nationalistic, racialistic, also Christian-infused identity. He moves on to discuss the Pale of Settlement, which is the western part of the Russian Empire that has a lot of Jews in it after the partition of Poland in the late 18th century. And on a fact-finding mission by the Russian imperial government, it was found that the Jews mainly made their money, more or less, by selling vodka to the local peasants, and this was causing issues. So to remedy the situation, the Statute of 1804 was passed, which tried to assimilate the Jews into more of like a Russian education system, either speaking Russian or German rather than Yiddish, banning the sale of liquor from Jews, and trying to at least limit the influence of the Kahal system, which was a form of organizing among the Jewish community by like religious leaders and such. And this type of self-governance, if you will, was later abolished, but the Statute of 1804 was kind of like the first attempt to at least limit its influence. And while we're on the subject, there was actually quite a few different kind of like fact-finding missions and different committees to kind of figure out what to do with the Jews during this time. And even Jones alludes to this, where he discusses that certain people were against Dershovin's views, albeit in Jones' mind because the Jews like bribed them or had monetary influence in the situation. But regardless, if you read John Clear's book, Russia Gathers Her Jews, Origins of the Jewish Question in Russia, he talks about how there were people who did not blame all the woes of the peasants on the Jews, and that there were areas where there were no Jews, but still like peasant drunkenness and poverty and agricultural woes, and that a lot of the blame could be put on the Polish noble like landlords rather than Jews, who were more of just like a middleman and fulfilling an economic role. So anyways, there was like back and forth on that, but moving on, problems in the Pale of Settlement more or less stayed the same, so it would just be like a reoccurring issue throughout Jewish history in Imperial Russia. We get to the Decembrist Revolt in 1825, which even Jones states did not have a big Jewish influence or involvement, but during this time, a movement known as the Haskalah emerged, otherwise known as the Jewish Enlightenment, in these Eastern European communities. He brings up people like Heinrich Heine in Germany, who were some of these Jews who converted to Christianity, but more or less just to not be barred from like certain universities and job positions and stuff like that the German state enacted at the time. It was just a cultural literary critic who had some influence on Karl Marx, who was from a family of Jews who converted to Lutheranism, again for this kind of more just like practical reasons rather than religious reasons, who also famously wrote on the Jewish question, which a lot of people see as kind of anti-Semitic. Some people kind of say otherwise. I mean, it doesn't really pertain much to anything here, but rather than like a religious or racial lens, he sees everything through an economic lens and class conflict, and that the emancipation of not only Jews, but basically everyone would be achieved only through communism, and that previous revolutions like the French Revolution and just like general Enlightenment thinking weren't like, I guess you'd say, radical enough, or just not really coming from the right place. I'm not really too sure. I always get confused by like Marxist stuff, but at the end of the day, it's whatever. It's just more like Jewish revolutionary spirit type of thinking. And after the failed revolutions of 1848, Marx doubled down on kind of class warfare, but another person, Moses Hess, kind of distanced himself from this kind of class thinking and kind of refocused more on race, and was one of the early founding fathers of Zionism. And Jones kind of correlates his thinking to Hitler later on, where both were kind of like national socialists who focus on race. And Hess saw Jews as a people kind of like uniquely geared towards revolution, and basically wanted Jews to like kind of take their own destiny, get out of the shtetls and reassert themselves as their own nation. And that's where he leaves off that chapter, and going into the next chapter we get to the Americas. Talks a bit about Nat Turner and Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary, and how these slave revolts kind of caused their own revolutionary fervor in the New World. And these slave rebellions weren't just homegrown, but they were taking ideas from European revolutions, and also people like William Lloyd Garrison, who was an early abolitionist, and points to other people like Thomas Paine and John Brown as kind of having the same messianic politics or kind of vision as people like Cromwell, kind of overturning the order of the day. I'm not really sure what his overall opinion on slavery is. Like, personally, I don't know what his like Catholic position is on that. I mean, I'm going to take the big moral leap here and say that slavery was bad, so I don't really blame people for having like revolutionary ideas about ending it, but that's just me, I guess. And Jones ties abolitionism with Unitarianism, which was like a, I guess you'd say, heresy kind of popular in the Americas at this time, or at least early US. And I guess a lot of the more like liberal Christians, you'd say, who maybe weren't as theologically orthodox as regular, like, I don't know, Trinitarian Christians, were more likely to be abolitionists, like Dr. William Channing, for example. And on page 608, he talks about how the Bible was used by both parties. Southerners used the Bible to protect and defend slavery, and abolitionists used it to protest against it. And I don't know, it does seem like Jones kind of thinks that the argument really was in favor of the Southerners, and he states that the Bible like doesn't oppose slavery anywhere, which, I mean, I guess technically that is correct. And in the minds of the Southerners, Jones puts it that the Northerners were just using the Bible in like kind of a foolhardy way, and were just preaching a kind of Christianity with like French revolutionary ideals. Jones then proceeds to talk about the Assing sisters, who were Jewish sisters from Germany who eventually moved to the US, who were part of the kind of like liberal 1848er socialists who moved to the US after the failed revolutions of 1848. More on that later, but then he starts to discuss Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, who apparently had kind of like a womanizing tendency and had a feud with William Lloyd Garrison over who would kind of lead the abolitionist movement. And there was, I guess you'd say, drama over his personal life and how that would fit as kind of like the public image of the abolition movement. And like any revolution, there were more like extreme sides to it, like earlier mentioned John Brown, who Jones likens to the Judaizing Puritans in early America in his revolutionary fervor and messianism. and discusses the Secret Six, who were like the backers of John Brown, who, as far as I could tell, none were Jewish. So a lot of the chapters is talking about abolitionism and kind of like the fears the South had over slave rebellion and stuff like that. He later discusses how Ottilie Assing ends up moving to New Jersey from Germany, one of the Jewish sisters I talked about earlier, and she ends up meeting Frederick Douglass, and I guess they have an affair and like live with each other. Jones has all these like weird personal insights on Frederick Douglass being like enamored by white women, and how Assing was also interested in him because she was like quote unquote kind of like mixed race, but not really because she was like half Jewish or something. It's just kind of funny, like he just like seems to psychoanalyze a lot, and I don't really know like what his sources could be on this, but it was just kind of funny to read. And I guess Assing like taught Frederick Douglass a lot of Enlightenment literature and theory, as well as kind of undermining his kind of like primitive Christian beliefs by showing him Feuerbach's work on the essence of Christianity. And in Jones' view, this was kind of like the main obstacle that mostly Jewish revolutionaries had in America when dealing with black people, because to quote him, the Negroes' faith in Christ was like kind of what helped them not succumb to revolutionary activity. And meanwhile, John Brown was eventually hanged and eulogized by a lot of famous Northerners like Ralph Waldo Emerson and others who kind of saw him as a martyr, like a modern-day Jesus Christ. Shortly thereafter, the Civil War erupts, which Jones seems to lay at the feet of the German 1848ers who came to America, who were kind of like revolutionary in their thinking. I don't really buy this because, I mean, most of the people he talks about in this chapter weren't from that group, besides Assing, and I just think, like, the internal contradictions of the U.S. up to this point, like, would have led to a civil war regardless of some like foreign influence, foreign immigration. So I didn't really get what he was alluding to there. After the war and eventually Assing and Frederick Douglass kind of break up, Assing commits suicide. Douglass, after like womanizing and stuff, just settles down with some white chick. Jones kind of points out this division between the two figures, that like the radical Jewish, half-Jewish chick was like kind of more radical in terms of like her anti-marriage views and like traditionalism, whereas Douglass still kind of had that, you know, to use Jones's words, like a Negro kind of attachment to Christianity and Jesus, or at least more like traditional. I don't know, it's kind of hard to like decipher what Jones' overall point is. Like he brings in a lot of like personal accounts and personal histories of people and tries to tie it in to like the Civil War, for example. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's very confusing to me at times, but whatever. And something I just thought was funny real quick too is Jones referred to Douglass as Dark Fred sometimes, and I don't know, when I read that first it just like really made me laugh, so that was pretty funny. But he kind of ends the chapter saying that Douglass paved the way for people like Booker T. Washington, who would lead the Black Civil Rights Movement later on, and how the Black-Jewish alliance in America kind of grew out from Booker T. Washington. And lastly, we get to chapter 15. Going back to Russia, Alexander II emancipates the serfs and starts to loosen some of the restrictions on Jews going into the Russian core and like working jobs and stuff. Previously, they were just restricted to the Pale of Settlement. And also around this time, after the Jewish Enlightenment and kind of some of falling away from like normative practicing Orthodox Judaism, a lot of Jews were attracted to like the nihilist movement and early Russian revolutionary activity. He brings up certain figures like Mark Natanson, who was a Jewish nihilist revolutionary kind of guy who took some influence from previous nihilist revolutionary thinkers who were not Jewish, like Nechayev, Ashutin, Karakozov, not sure if I'm pronouncing those right. And Jews did come to be disproportionately represented in a lot of these groups, although it wasn't until in the later part of the 1800s. And I did do a video kind of covering this topic, so I'll put a screenshot in there as well. Weren't the majority or anything, but still definitely overrepresented. And he explains this because socialism and revolutionary activity all just kind of stems from the Jewish revolutionary spirit, so it makes sense. Again, from my point of view, I would just say that a lot of ideologies like communism or socialism kind of attract people who may have been persecuted in the past or kind of like treated as others. Many minorities are attracted to communism. I've covered that in other videos as well, but anyways, following the assassination of the Tsar, that really just blamed a lot of things, and a lot of pogroms started after that. Jones says says that while a lot of people blamed the government for these things, others said that it was more just like a spontaneous act of violence, and if anything, that revolutionaries kind of wanted these pogroms to happen because they thought that it would create like an overall sense of revolutionary fervor that would lead to the overthrow of like the state and stuff like that. From my reading in the past, it definitely does seem like government wasn't like directly responsible, but they certainly weren't trying to like protect Jews or be like super preventative of the pogroms either. And definitely some revolutionaries did kind of praise the pogroms just because the peasantry was doing something, so it was just kind of a good sign, more or less. He talks about one famous pogrom, the one that happened in Kishinev, where he kind of like downplays the brutality of it, and I mean, I would say he kind of victim blames the Jews in that one. And generally, if you want to read more on these kind of topics, you should just read like anything by John Clear. He seems to be the main guy who wrote on this period of Russian history and has books directly related to this, and I think a bit more balanced in his view, but anyway. And Jones kind of portrays like the Russian government as being the real victim here because they were, after the Kishinev pogrom, Russia just like looked bad in the international press. It's not really like the Kishinev pogrom was like the only one, and there was numerous kind of calls in like mainstream newspapers in Russia to like attack Jews and stuff and blame them for everything. So I think it was like just generally pretty straightforward thing that Russia was just not the greatest place for Jews, and people may have thought the Tsar could have done better to withhold some of the violent uprisings that occurred, which in large part were kind of just due to how Russia couldn't really fully modernize and get in to the full swing of the Industrial Revolution. It was at various points engaged in different wars and lost those wars, while at the same time expanding territory and incorporating new peoples into their lands. So it was just kind of like a generally chaotic time. He talks about the Civilta Katolika magazine. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but it was basically just a Catholic magazine that wrote on the Jewish question around the time of the Dreyfus Affair, which basically kind of lays the groundwork for what Jones's whole outlook is about. So a lot of the ideas he gets are basically from that, and he goes over some more like revolutionary activity stuff in Russia, but ends the chapter with the assassination of Stolypin, don't know how to pronounce that name, by Dmitry Bogrov, who was a Jewish revolutionary, and basically says that this assassination kind of led to the events that would occur later down the line, where Russia loses World War I and basically goes into the Bolshevik Revolution. So anyways, that's the end of this video. I was just looking back at my old notes and like didn't see that I had written too much on these chapters, so kind of a shorter video, but yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching the video. Peace out.